Stop me if you've heard this one before. Venezuela was a rich, prosperous country. Then, Hugo Chavez came along with his socialism, destroyed the economy, and turned paradise into hell. The end. It's a nice story. Simple, clean, good guys, bad guys, perfect for a tweet or a political talking point. There's just one problem. It's not true. Don't get me wrong, Chavez made catastrophic decisions. Maduro made even worse ones. The socialist experiment was a disaster of historic proportions. I'm not here to defend any of that. But if you want to understand why Venezuela collapsed, if you really want to understand, you need to go back further. Much further. Before Chavez, before the Bolivarian Revolution, before the Red Berets and the anti-imperialist speeches. You need to go back to a time when Venezuela was ruled not by socialists, but by a tight circle of families who treated the country like a private estate, who extracted billions while the population festered in poverty, who created the exact conditions that made a figure like Chavez not just possible, but inevitable. This is the story they don't want you to hear, the prequel to the disaster, the original sin. This is how Venezuela was already broken before socialism ever touched it. 1. The myth of the golden age. Let's start by destroying a myth. The standard narrative goes like this. Venezuela before Chavez was a thriving democracy with a prosperous middle class. Then the socialists ruined everything. Here's the reality. Yes, Venezuela was a democracy from 1958 to 1998. Yes, it had oil wealth. Yes, Caracas had shopping malls and highways and a skyline that looked like Miami. But that's not the whole picture. That's the postcard. Let me show you what was behind it. In 1989, 9 years before Chavez was elected, Venezuela exploded. Not metaphorically, literally. It was called the Caracazo. On the 27th of February 1989, President Carlos Andres Perez announced an IMF-backed austerity package. Gas prices doubled overnight. Bus fares shot up 30%. The price of basic goods spiked. The response wasn't a protest. It was an uprising. Tens of thousands of people from the poorest neighborhoods poured into the streets of Caracas. They looted stores. They burned buses. They expressed 4 decades of accumulated rage. The government's response? The military opened fire on its own citizens. Estimates of the death toll range from 300 official to over 3,000 according to human rights organizations. Bodies were dumped in mass graves. Entire neighborhoods were terrorized. This was Venezuela before Chavez. This was the golden age. So the question isn't just what did Chavez do wrong? The question is, what was already so broken that a military coup leader who had tried to overthrow the government could win a democratic election 9 years later with 56% of the vote? The answer lies in the decades before, in the system that was built, in the families that built it. 2. The Pact of Punto Fijo, democracy for the few. To understand Venezuela's original sin, we need to go back to 1958. The dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez had just been overthrown. Venezuela was ready for democracy. 3 political leaders sat down to design the new system. Rómulo Betancourt from Acción Democrática, Rafael Caldera from COPEI, Jovito Villalba from URD. They created something called the Pact of Punto Fijo, named after Caldera's house where they met. On paper, it was a noble agreement. The 3 parties would respect electoral results, share power peacefully, and prevent any return to dictatorship. Democracy would be protected. In practice, they created a cartel. For the next 40 years, power alternated between 2 parties, AD and COPEI. They called it Punto Fijismo. Others called it a 2-party duopoly. The third party, URD, was quickly marginalized. Anyone outside the system was excluded. The pact wasn't just political. It was economic. The 2 parties divided up the state like a birthday cake. Government jobs, contracts, oil revenue, all distributed through party loyalty. If you wanted to work in the public sector, you needed a party card. If you wanted a government contract, you needed the right connections. This system had a name, clientelism. Votes were purchased with jobs and favors. Loyalty was rewarded with access to oil money. The parties didn't represent ideologies. They represented patronage networks. And at the top of these networks sat a small circle of families who had been running Venezuela since before the oil even started flowing. 3. The 12 Apostles, the families who owned Venezuela. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Venezuelan historians sometimes refer to a group called Los Doce Apostles. The 12 Apostles. It's not an official designation. You won't find it in any legal document. But everyone in Venezuelan elite circles knew what it meant. These were the families, roughly a dozen, who controlled the commanding heights of the Venezuelan economy: banking, media, construction, import, export, and most importantly, the service contracts that surrounded the state oil company. I'm not going to name specific families because I don't want to get sued, but I'll describe the system. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976, creating PDVSA. But nationalization didn't mean the private sector was cut out. Far from it. PDVSA needed contractors, it needed services, it needed imports. And these contracts, worth billions of dollars, flowed to a remarkably small circle of well-connected companies. The same families who owned the banks provided the financing. The same families who owned the construction companies built the infrastructure. The same families who owned the import businesses supplied the equipment. They formed a closed loop of wealth extraction that captured an enormous share of oil revenue before it ever reached the Venezuelan people. This wasn't illegal. That's the key point. They wrote the laws. They funded the politicians who wrote the laws. The system was designed to benefit them, and it worked exactly as designed. By the 1990s, Venezuela had one of the highest levels of inequality in Latin America. The Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, was catastrophic. The richest 10% controlled over 35% of all income. Meanwhile, in the barrios of Caracas, families lived in tin shacks clinging to hillsides without reliable water or sewage. Two Venezuelas existed simultaneously. One shopped in Miami and sent children to American universities. The other couldn't afford bus fare to get to work. 4. The oil curse, plenty for the few, crumbs for the many. Let's talk about oil, because oil is where the real crime happened. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than anyone. This should have made every Venezuelan wealthy. Instead, it made a small elite fabulously rich while funding a bloated, corrupt state that provided just enough crumbs to prevent revolution. Here's how the oil curse works. When a government has oil revenue, it doesn't need to tax its citizens. When it doesn't need to tax citizens, it doesn't need their consent. When it doesn't need consent, it doesn't need to provide services to earn loyalty. It just needs to provide enough patronage to key groups: the military, the party faithful, the business elite. This is exactly what happened in Venezuela. Oil revenue funded a massive public sector bloated with political appointees. Government jobs became rewards for loyalty, not positions requiring competence. The bureaucracy grew fat and inefficient. Oil revenue funded imports that undercut local production. Why grow food when you can import it cheaply with petrodollars? Venezuelan agriculture withered. Venezuelan manufacturing never developed. The country became dependent on oil for 95% of its export earnings. Oil revenue funded subsidies that seemed generous but were actually regressive. Gasoline was essentially free, but the people who benefited most were those who owned cars, the middle and upper classes. The poor took buses. And oil revenue funded corruption on an almost incomprehensible scale. 5. The corruption machine. How billions disappeared. Let me paint you a picture of pre-Chavez corruption. Carlos Andrés Pérez, the president who ordered the Caracazo massacre, was later impeached for corruption. He had embezzled 250 million bolivars from a secret presidential fund. This was the man who was supposed to represent Venezuelan democracy. But Pérez was just the tip of the iceberg. The corruption was structural. It was built into how business was done. The government would announce a major project, a highway, a dam, a building. Companies would bid for the contract. But the bidding was theater. The winner was predetermined. The price was inflated, and a percentage, typically 10-30%, would kick back to the officials who approved the contract. This happened at every level: national, state, municipal. Billions of dollars in oil revenue cycled through this machine. The money left Venezuela for bank accounts in Miami, Madrid, and Geneva. The projects were often delayed, over budget, or never completed at all. The Venezuelan people knew this. Everyone knew this. It wasn't a secret. Corruption was discussed openly. It was joked about. It was accepted as the way things were. But acceptance is not the same as approval. The anger accumulated. Year after year, scandal after scandal, the gap between the rich and poor widening, the promises of democracy ringing hollow. All it needed was a spark. 6. The 4th of February 1992, the man who would be king. At 11 p.m. on the 4th of February 1992, a group of military officers launched a coup against President Carlos Andrés Pérez. The coup failed, the tanks were stopped, the rebels were arrested. By morning, it was over. But then something strange happened. The government made a fateful decision. They allowed the coup leader to appear on television to call on his fellow rebels to surrender. It was supposed to be a moment of humiliation. Instead, it became a moment of creation. Hugo Chávez, an unknown lieutenant colonel, looked into the camera and said something that would change Venezuelan history. Por ahora. For now. Comrades, unfortunately, for now, the objectives we set for ourselves have not been achieved. For now. Those two words echoed across a country that had lost faith in its institutions. Here was a man who had tried to change things. He had failed, but he wasn't giving up. For now. Within hours, Chávez went from unknown officer to folk hero. The poor saw him as a champion. The establishment saw him as a threat. But everyone saw that the system's legitimacy was crumbling. Chávez went to prison. He served 2 years. And when he got out, he found a country even more broken than before. 7. The final collapse of the old order, 1994 to 1998. The years between the failed coup and Chávez's election were Venezuela's last chance to reform itself. It didn't. Rafael Caldera, one of the original architects of Punto Fijo, won the 1993 election by running as an outsider against his own creation. He promised change, he delivered more of the same. The banking crisis of 1994 was perhaps the most damning indictment of the old elite. A series of major banks collapsed due to fraud and mismanagement. The government bailed them out to the tune of billions of dollars. Venezuelan taxpayers paid for the crimes of Venezuelan bankers. Many of the bankers faced no consequences. Some fled abroad with their fortunes intact. Meanwhile, oil prices collapsed in the late 1990 seconds. The patronage machine that held the system together started running out of fuel. Government services deteriorated. Infrastructure crumbled. The middle class, which had been the buffer between the elite and the poor, began to shrink. By 1998, both AD and COPI, the two parties that had ruled Venezuela for 4 decades, were completely discredited. Trust in institutions had collapsed. The old elite had failed to reform, failed to share the wealth, failed to build a country that worked for more than a privileged few. Into this vacuum stepped Hugo Chávez, no longer in a tank, now in a voting booth. He won with 56% of the vote. It wasn't even close. 8. The revolution that the elite created. Here's the part that the standard narrative leaves out. Hugo Chávez didn't create the conditions for revolution, he inherited them. The inequality? Created by 40 years of elite extraction. The oil dependency? Created by decades of failing to diversify the economy. The institutional rot? Created by a system designed for patronage, not governance. The popular rage? Created by the Caracazo, the banking crisis, the endless corruption scandals. Chávez didn't have to convince Venezuelans that the system was broken. They already knew. They had been living it. Did Chávez make things worse? Absolutely. His economic policies were disastrous. His concentration of power destroyed what remained of institutional checks. His successors drove the country into the ground. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The elite opposition that spent 20 years denouncing Chavismo never seriously reckoned with their own role in creating it. They never asked, why did the majority of Venezuelans vote for a man who had tried to overthrow the government? Why did they keep voting for his movement even as the economy collapsed? Why did they trust a military strongman more than the established democratic parties? The answer is that 40 years of supposed democracy had delivered wealth for the few and crumbs for the many. When given a choice between the devil they knew and a new devil who promised change, Venezuelans chose change. 9. The lesson nobody learned. The Venezuelan tragedy has 2 acts, and both matter. Act 1. An elite captured the state, extracted the oil wealth, neglected the poor, and allowed institutions to rot until the system collapsed under the weight of its own inequality. Act 2. A populist movement took power, doubled down on oil dependency, destroyed the private sector, printed money until the currency died, and drove the country into humanitarian catastrophe. The standard narrative only tells Act 2. It's politically convenient. It lets certain people say socialism always fails without examining what came before. It lets the old elite present themselves as victims rather than architects of disaster. But you cannot understand Act 2 without Act 1. Chavez didn't appear from nowhere. He was the response to a specific history, a symptom of a disease that had been festering for decades. And here's the lesson that applies far beyond Venezuela. When elites capture too much of a society's wealth, when they rig the rules in their favor, when they allow inequality to grow unchecked while the institutions that should provide accountability rot, they are not creating stability. They are creating the conditions for their own destruction. The Venezuelan elite thought they could manage the system forever. They thought a little patronage here, a little repression there would keep the lid on. They were wrong. The revolution didn't come because Venezuelans loved socialism. It came because they hated what they had. When your choices are a corrupt oligarchy or a charismatic populist promising change, many people will choose the change, even if the change makes things worse. 10. The verdict. Shared blame, shared tragedy. So, who destroyed Venezuela? The honest answer, almost everyone who had power over the last 60 years. The Punto Fijo elite created a closed system that excluded the majority and extracted oil wealth for the few. They built the inequality, they starved the institutions, they created the rage. Chavez channeled that rage into a movement that concentrated power, gutted checks and balances, and made the economy entirely dependent on oil prices and government largesse. Maduro inherited the worst of both worlds, an extractive state with no institutions, and drove it into the ground with incompetence, corruption, and repression. The tragedy is that Venezuela had enough wealth to provide a good life for everyone. It still does. The oil is still there, the land is still fertile, the people are still talented and resilient. What Venezuela never had was a system designed for shared prosperity rather than elite extraction. Neither the pre-Chavez oligarchy nor the Chavista state built institutions that served the many. Both were extractive. Both failed. Both should be held accountable. Conclusion. The warning. Here's why this history matters beyond Venezuela. Because the pattern repeats. In country after country, we see elites who capture too much, who rig the rules, who convince themselves that the status quo will last forever. And in country after country, we see the backlash. Populist movements that promise to tear down the system, that often make things worse, but that win because the alternative has already failed. Venezuela is not a story about socialism defeating capitalism. It's a story about extraction defeating inclusion, about short-term greed defeating long-term stability, about elites who couldn't see that their own behavior was planting the seeds of revolution. The families who ruled Venezuela before Chavez largely escaped. They're in Miami now, or Madrid, or New York. Their fortunes intact, their children in private schools. They write op-eds about the tragedy of socialism. But they don't write about how they helped create the conditions that made socialism possible. They don't acknowledge that a more just system, one that shared the oil wealth more broadly, invested in education and healthcare, built institutions that served everyone, might have prevented the whole disaster. Venezuela didn't have to happen. That's the tragedy. It was a choice. Many choices made by many people over many decades. The question now, for Venezuela and for every country watching, is whether we can learn from those choices, whether we can build systems that include rather than extract, whether we can reform before the pressure becomes revolution, or whether we'll keep repeating the same story over and over with different names and different flags, always surprised when the ending is the same. If this analysis made you think, hit that subscribe button, because understanding history isn't about assigning blame, it's about recognizing patterns. And the Venezuelan pattern is playing out in more places than we want to admit. See you in the comments. And remember, economics isn't just about money. It's about power, and who wields it, and what happens when they wield it only for themselves.